Well, everybody, please have a seat. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for attending today. Before we do anything, I have an important announcement to make. In the middle of today's event, the fire alarm is going to go off. Don't worry about it. You can sit where you are. You're just going to have to hold your ears for about 10 to 15 seconds. We'll ride this thing out. We just found out about this before the event started. It won't be a big deal, but just be prepared. This is going to happen. We don't know quite when exactly, but it will. Setting that aside, thank you so much for coming today to our event, Making the Case for Smart Juvenile Prosecution. My name is Vikrant Reddy. I work in the Center for Effective Justice here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And those of you who are familiar with TPPF know that one of our key principles is limited government. And I think most of you are familiar with a lot of the work that we do in healthcare and in energy regulation and in education and all these different sectors where we make the argument that at a certain point, government involvement in these spheres becomes counterproductive. I think we're very consistent in this message because we found that the same holds true in the criminal justice system. And we'll talk today about the juvenile justice system in particular. Government involvement in this sphere at a certain point just becomes extremely counterproductive. There are cases, and many of you have heard about these, where kids who 30 years ago, because of minor misbehavior in the classroom, perhaps, making too much noise, who would have previously been taken to the principal's office or been handled by their parents or even by, local community leaders, maybe at their church, something like that, they now get sent into the criminal justice system. And it just starts this awful downward spiral. And we've got a bunch of really terrific guests here today who are going to talk about these kinds of problems, what they've observed. They're going to talk about terrific solutions that they've seen. They'll talk a little bit about the solutions they'd like to see. They'll talk about the resources that they need to improve what we do as a state in this area. And they'll also talk a little bit about how to communicate these ideas. So without too much more of an introduction, let me get into introducing all of today's panelists. Our first discussant is George Gascon, who has traveled quite a way to be here today, quite a ways geographically and even further culturally and politically, perhaps. Mr. Gascon comes to us from San Francisco, where he is the district attorney. Before becoming DA in San Francisco, he spent time in law enforcement. He was police chief in Mesa, Arizona, in Los Angeles, and also in San Francisco. Some of you may be familiar with a lot of the really innovative work that he's done. His alternative sentencing program, the neighborhood courts and neighborhood prosecution program, and the county-level sentencing commission that he instituted. Mr. Gascon has a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from California State University. He took his law degree from Western State University College of Law. Please welcome George Gascon.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's interesting that the more work that I do in other parts of the country and even internationally, the more that we actually share so much in common. So I know that sometimes where it appears that there may be a tremendous divide between how we view the world, the reality is that we share more in common than we don't. And I really appreciate the foundation for the invite, and specifically for Mark Levin, who was the one that connected us. The juvenile justice system is a system that and I believe many of you in this room probably have a great deal of passion for, because it's really where it all starts. And what we do with our young people has a tremendous impact in what is going to occur years to come. And when we're talking about public safety, reducing the level of reoffending when someone comes in touch with the system is really the way to make our community safer. And we have found out in the last few years that just simply incarcerating and warehousing people doesn't really work. It's very expensive. And I know that actually Texas has led the way in reductions of incarceration. In fact, I often in conversations in California, I know we're going through our own struggle about how do we reduce our prison population. We have looked at some of the solutions that Texas brought to the table that seem to be working very well, and trying to see what are some of the things that would work for us. What I'd like to do today, very briefly, I want to give you kind of a quick national overview of sort of where the juvenile justice system has been and it is today. Then I'm going to go into some programs, or particularly one program that we're doing in San Francisco, and you know, it's new and it's different, and you know, there may be something there that may fit for you. And then I know that there will be other panelists that will be talking about their own personal experience, and certainly we'll all be available for questions and answers. But you know, overall, in looking at our system, if you look at it from the national level, what we have seen is some really interesting patterns. We have seen actually a reduction in incarceration. If you go back to about 1985 and you fast forward to today, we have seen an actual significant reduction in the numbers of juveniles that are in custody or in some level of incapacitation. At the same time, we have seen an increase in the level of court action and probation, and that seems to be pretty uniform throughout the country. So I think that we have all started about 1985, which for those who have been in the system that long, know that those were years where, you know, nationally and quite frankly, California started leading the way with 3 strikes, the first 3-strike law in the country. You know, when we started getting really addicted to heavy incarceration rates. And we have seen that cycle sort of taper off. And while we're still touching probably as many kids in some areas, we have seen a reduction in arrest, a reduction in incarceration, and a significant increase in probation and other community-based supervision. Just to very briefly, the numbers are if you look at the cases 1995 nationally, by the way, there was 1.15 million kids that were arrested and touched the system. By 1997, that went down to 1.5, and by 2009, that came down. By 97, it went down to 1.9, and by 2009, 1.5. Significant reduction. At the same time, we have seen about a 30% increase in court-directed activities, probation, and community-based supervision. However, there's an area that we continue to have a problem. It's a problem that is really entrenched, especially in the urban centers, but I think even in some of the more rural and suburban areas, we see the same problem, and that is the problem of how we deal with the African American population, the youth. And those numbers haven't necessarily abated at all. And what we have seen also is an increase in the number of girls, particularly African American girls, that are being touched by the system. In San Francisco, to give you for instance, again, we pretty much track the national trends. We have had in the last decade or so, we've had a reduction of about 46% in the number of young people that we're arresting or referrals to the juvenile system, and about a 49% in the cases that we have prosecuted. So significant drops. However, when we look at the area of how we're dealing with our African American population, in 2012, 56% of every case that we touched in our juvenile system was in African American youth. And yet our population, our black population in the city, is trending down now. It's probably below 6%. So you can see there's some significant disconnect there in what is going on. And by the way, we're not unique. I know that if you were to look at most urban centers, and I dare say that if you were to look at many of your own communities here in Texas, you would see very similar numbers. So this is an area that is really troubling, and an area that we need to figure out how do we do better. Now, some of the things that are driving a lot of our numbers lately, interestingly enough, are, and now I'm going to really shorten, I'm going to take it now just to the last 18 months or so, is the area of cell phones and mobile communication device robberies and theft. It's just skyrocketing. In San Francisco, 50% of all of our robberies involve a smartphone. New York is about almost 40%. Nationwide is about a third. And that has a tremendous impact, again, in our youth, and specifically a tremendous impact in our minority youth and youth coming from families that are poor, and the availability of taking a cell phone, stealing it very quickly, and turning it around. And in major cities like San Francisco, you can sell a stolen iPhone. If it is a i5, probably for around $300, no questions asked. So it's just so profitable to do so. And these phones, by the way, if they travel internationally, a cell phone, an iPhone in Hong Kong will sell for about $2,000. So you can see the growth of this industry, and that's why we have to come up with some other solutions, but I don't want to get out of the subject here. But I just want to kind of show you what some of the drivers are today. What we started to do in San Francisco is we recognize that there is not any one solution to any of these problems, but we wanted to see how we lower our rate of recidivism with a population that seems to be more entrenched, that we haven't been able to get our arms around it. And we started a thing called community conferencing, which is a restorative justice model. This has been tried, it was tried in Alameda County, which is one of our neighboring county, and we decided to try that. And basically what we do with the community conferencing is we look at serious cases. And at this point, we're looking at robberies, we look at burglaries, we look at thefts that are, more higher dollar amounts. And if the individual goes through a process, and basically the way we have it is we have the head of our juvenile division. She looks at the cases, and what she does is very quickly she assesses if the case has the contents and the parameters that we're looking for, and then the cases get randomized so that there is absolutely no cherry picking to the case. And then the cases that get selected, they go to a nonprofit which does the handling of this community conference. There's a lot of pre-work with the youth and the victim and the community. The cases then there's basically agreements that come up as to what is going to be done for the victim to restore the victim, what is the youth going to do for the community, what are they going to do for the family and themselves. If there's an agreement, the contract is completed within 6 months. If there is a failure, the person is brought back and then we prosecute him under our traditional process. In the places that this has been tried already in Alameda County, they're seeing a reduction in recidivism that is very significant. We're in the early stages of our process, but we believe that this is really a way that will provide us the opportunity to decriminalize a lot of young people and hopefully be able to make our community safer. In California, a robbery is a strike. It doesn't matter whether you're juvenile or not, so you're talking about very serious consequences for those cases, and a lot of these young people, even though they may do little time as a juvenile, if they reoffend as an adult, they end up doing significant time in our prison system. And with that, I thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to some of our other speakers, and I look forward to our dialogue. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Patricia Lykos. Judge Lykos is a former district court judge and a retired district attorney from Harris County. As a matter of fact, she was the first elected female district attorney of Harris County. She was also the first female judge of a county court at law in Harris County. She also has a background in law enforcement. She worked as a police officer as an undergraduate and as a law student, worked her way through school that way. She took her bachelor's degree from the University of Houston and her law degree from the South Texas College of Law.
Thank you.
Certainly.
If our solar system operated on the same dynamics as the criminal justice system, the rapture would have already occurred. Okay. When I was a young police officer, I've been involved in the criminal justice system for about 4 decades. One of my assignments was in the juvenile division. We had index cards for records. And I can remember the Army recruiters or military recruiters coming down, going through the index cards, employers coming down there, and they'd say, oh, trespassing, well, that must have been really a burglar or so forth. And so we officers took it upon ourselves that skateboarding was big back then. And so many young people were arrested for being in parking garages and charged with trespassing. So the uniform officers, plainclothes officers, took it upon ourselves, called the parents, come pick them up, and no index cards. Until one was a child of a lawyer who sued us. and no more taking the kids home. The changes that we've witnessed over the past 4 decades are phenomenal. When I was first an officer, very little drugs. Among the whites, you had angel dust. All the major ethnic groups used a little bit of marijuana, but there was no cocaine back then. And the offenses were relatively minor, and there were some burglaries, very few robberies, and so forth. There was glue sniffing was a big deal back then. Then LEA came along to combat that tune-in, turn-on, and drop-out crowd and the drug explosion that we had in our country. And there was much good that came from that. You had law enforcement agencies actually working together. It started out with getting, groovy tools, and they would develop plans for riots, urban unrest, and so forth. And that collaboration grew with the radios, intercommunication, and so forth, so that the closest unit could respond and so forth. Unfortunately, it took other branches of government to catch up. For too many years, the executive, judicial, and legislative branches operated as though they were autonomous and with no regard whatsoever on their effect on the other components of the system. I'm happy to tell you that there has been a sea change thanks to organizations like the Texas Policy Foundation. We now collaborate together, we research together. Our county has created a criminal justice council. One of the things that we implemented when I took office of district attorney is for nonviolent offenders, first offense, Class A, Class B, if they qualified, we put them on deferred prosecution. Because if you put these kids into detention with the gangbangers, we have lost them forever. And so they're placed under supervision, and we had 2 levels of supervision. The minimum level, and then one where there was family problems, drug treatment, whatever. I am so pleased to tell you that we started this in March of '09, and as of November of this year, we have had 7,500 plus children successfully complete the program, no charges ever filed on them, no criminal record. And if you believe that a juvenile record is secret, there's a bridge up north that's for sale. With respect to the recidivist rate, 88% have never reoffended, and they've aged out of the system. So one time, one done, over with. Our juvenile probation department in Harris County is phenomenal. They have now 40 programs working with children, starting with gangs. They have special calendars for females. They have special for drugs, you name it, whether it's domestic violence and so forth. And if you'll permit me to brag upon the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department, since 2008, starting in 2009, they've had a 41% drop in detention admissions, a 30% drop in the detention daily population. Of course, the drop that occurred because of the district attorney's office. You know, you've heard of unintended consequences. Well, there are unanticipated benefits. We've saved the county over $3 million with this deferred prosecution because there are no need for court-appointed attorneys, service a citation, and the court time taken up so we can focus on the more serious cases. They've had a 60-some%, almost 70% drop in children who are committed to what used to be known as TYC. And then 61% drop in kids being transferred and certified as adults. We're not social workers, but we have to understand the social changes that have occurred in our country, the number of children who don't have 2 parents at home. And so we are blessed in my county with the non-governmental organizations, whether they're religious-based or not, who are now providing services. To give you another initiative, the worst public housing project in the county was called Haverstock. 2,400 people lived there, 700 of them were children. And it had barbed wire all around it. It was like a concentration camp that was patrolled by dope dealers and pimps, okay? The elementary school next door, the children were wearing gang colors and flashing gang signs because these were the only males that they were able to observe. So I took a look at this and I said, you know, that's a small town in Texas, 2,400 people. What makes a small town? Well, you have to have religious organizations, you have to have law enforcement, you have to have the Chamber of Commerce, you have your social organizations, your school districts, and so forth. We brought them all together, not one red cent grant money. Everyone came together. We did the research on them and found out that the Crips and the Bloods were actually working together. And incidentally, the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood work together, too. You can't even trust racists now, you know. And so we identified, can you imagine, there were like 4,000 calls for service on this 2,400 population in 1 year. We identified those who were arrested and went in and got temporary restraining orders, a temporary injunction, and then permanent injunctions against them going in and around this whole area. The junior high school, the middle school, said there is a sea change in the attitude of the children. Businesses are now springing up around the neighborhood because they're not being dominated by the less savory characters, the drugs, the prostitution, and so forth. An anonymous donor came in and built a civic center for them. The sheriff's office has a substation there. So it was Texans helping Texans, and I assume that that's what they do in California, too. Do the Right Thing is a youth anti-violence program. It's a national program. We have several sites here in Texas. The children write and respond to 3 questions. How has violence affected me? What, in my opinion, is the causation? And what are my proposed solutions? It is targeted to 7th and 8th graders. And again, that's where we lose them. Once we get to high school, it is very difficult to turn them around. This is a very vulnerable age group. Not only are they growing physically and the hormones are kicking in, but their brain is being rewired. And the last thing that gets rewired is self-control. What's so heartening, in Harris County, we had 16,000 children write. Statewide, 30,000 write. And the result was it's the critical thinking skills, the research that they had to do, the realization, how do you stop violence? It starts with me, the personal responsibility, and then the obligation to reach out to others. We're at a real crossroads in our country today. We have got to do something about the entertainment industry, where these fashion houses that cater to young people show teeny boppers, billboards with what appears to be a menage a trois. There are 10-year-olds today who know more about depravity than I knew as a police officer. I would submit to you that social controls are the strongest controls of all. And we've got to find some way to inculcate that. And through the various programs that you described in San Francisco, what is being done in Harris County and other jurisdictions, we're doing that, but we've got to do it on a macro level. And I thank very much the foundation for holding this particular event, because I think it's going to be a catalyst here today for a national movement. Thank you all.
I am especially excited to welcome our third speaker, Riley Shaw, because he comes from my hometown of Fort Worth, Texas. Riley is the Chief Juvenile Prosecutor for the Tarrant County Criminal District Attorney's Office. He has prosecuted juvenile delinquency cases for the last 14 years. He's been the guest editor for the 7th edition of Texas Juvenile Law by Robert Dawson, prominent treatise that some of you in the room will know. He was named a top criminal attorney by Fort Worth, Texas Magazine, and he has won the Oscar A. Sherrill Memorial Award from the Texas District and County Attorneys Association. Please welcome Riley Shaw.
Well, good afternoon now. How's everybody doing? Good. I want to talk to you a little bit about basically innovations in Texas and innovations that I've seen on the ground in Tarrant County. For those to kind of make sense, we need to look backwards a little bit. Juvenile justice system in Texas has changed a lot in the last 10 years, in particular since 2008. Since 2008, we have dropped the population in our youth facilities by about 75%. That's kids in custody. I know in Tarrant County in particular, in the last 10 years, our detention numbers are down by half. One of the things that our legislature did this past session was, for the most part, got Class C tickets out of schools. All of those things are making a difference in how we're working with children who are at risk. As a prosecutor, when I look at these kids, I'm looking at the tension between short-term public safety and long-term public safety. It's easy to lock someone up in the short term, but in the long term, they're all coming home, right? They're kids. So we want to put them in the best position that we can so that we're happy to see them when they're home, and so that they have an opportunity for an education, for a vocation, for a good life. Some of the things that we have looked at over the years in Tarrant County and that we've currently implemented, I'm pretty proud of. We pioneered a drug court program about 15 years ago. We've still got it going. Children who come in who are first-time offenders, who have substance abuse issues, have an opportunity to go through a drug court program, receive the services they need, and if they are successful, they're found not delinquent and their records are sealed. So it all goes away. We've had a lot of success with that program. We are actually looking at some new programming dealing with, in an effort to divert young sex offenders. In particular, with the advent of the internet, as it has gotten pushed out, kids are being exposed to things that they didn't see before at a very, very young age. And we're trying to get our arms around that problem, and particularly with the youngest ones, and keep them from getting further into the system. That program is upcoming. I know the thing that I'm probably most excited about is an issue that I have seen over and over and over. When you look at our youth populations, you take them all together and you look for three things. You look for drug issues, you look for CPS involvement, and you look for mental health issues. You take those three things together, you're probably looking at 40 to 50% of the kids that come through the system. And those systems that work with those issues haven't been talking to each other. We don't need new agencies. We don't need to hire more people. We need to leverage the people that are out there right now. So one of the things that we're trying to do statewide is create a crossover court system. Whether it's going to be a formal crossover court or an informal crossover court. In Tarrant County, we are working with our local MHMR, with local faith-based organizations, with CPS, in trying to bring all of the services we have through Juvenile, all the services they have through CPS, all the services available through MHMR, to try and get these kids on track. It's very exciting. We're in the beginning stages. I know there are some other counties that are working on it, but it is something that I think can make a big difference. Another program that we have in a couple of different locations in Tarrant County, and this is actually federally funded, we have a couple of weed and seed areas. And those weed and seed areas, actually was on the board of one in Arlington. And what we do, we bring that community together and we get educational services in with a particular zip code, a high-risk zip code, get educational services, get health services, get food, and get that community together and get them talking. And one of the things that I heard from George a few minutes ago, he talked about his community conferencing and restorative justice. Well, this is a form of doing that. When you get the community together and get them talking, they can start handling some of these at-risk kids without them ever hitting a juvenile justice system. And we are, in fact, looking at some restorative justice models for some new programming in Tarrant County. I know the city of Fort Worth is looking at one right now, and I look forward to seeing how that plays out long term. It is a unique time. The way that we worked with kids in the past we've rethought it and we're changing it radically. I don't know that we're ever going to get to a place where we won't have an at-risk kid. We're always going to have at-risk kids, but the way that we deal with them, the way that we interact with them, the way that we turn them around, I think is getting a lot smarter. And I look forward to seeing how it develops over the next few years. Finally, I want to thank, I will say this, the Texas Public Policy Foundation is doing a lot of good stuff in this nation. I fully support doing more with less, and we can do more as a community to get these kids on track and to get them the opportunities that they need while keeping the public safe. I look forward to your questions when we're done.
Our final speaker today is a member of the Texas Legislature. It is Representative Joe Moody from El Paso. He represents the 78th House District out in West Texas. He serves on the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee and on the Select Committee on Criminal Procedure, which we have for this next year and a half. He's also a member of the Local and Consent Calendars Committee, and he is on the Defense and Veterans Affairs Committee. He has a law degree from Texas Tech School of Law, and we're very happy to have him here today. Please welcome Representative Moody.
Thank you, Vikrant. I've had kind of a wild ride in my political career. I was elected in 2008 as the youngest member of the Texas House in the state of Texas. Was unelected in 2010. I don't know if I was the youngest member ever unelected, but in 2012 I decided to give it another shot and got back. And both times I got to serve on the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. I was a prosecutor back home, and so I think it was kind of a natural fit for me. And that's where they kind of tend to like to put freshman legislators anyway, because there's lots of bills, lots of work, and maybe the senior members don't want to sit in committee till 4 a.m. like we did multiple times this session. I love it. I think it's important work, and I think it says a lot about our values as a community. But I get a lot of questions asked to me, well, what's different when you were there in 2009 and when you showed up in 2013? And one of the biggest differences I saw, especially the work on Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, was the presence of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I don't know that I saw them at any committee hearings back in 2009, but they were on every issue, well-versed and testifying, Mark testifying, other members testifying about these issues that impact so many people, and the dialogue had changed. I mean, the dialogue had changed literally in just one session of being gone. You were looking at cost. You know, what are we getting for the money we put into our criminal justice system? What are we getting back out? Employability of those, especially, and I think it really touches on the issue of juvenile justice that I'll get into. And what can we do to better our system? We know that for a long time, Texas was known as tough on crime, hang 'em high, and things of those, those types of phrases that were thrown out there. As a former prosecutor, I'll tell you, I don't have a problem locking someone up. I've personally prosecuted people and personally sent people away for a very long time. I think there are some people that is the right thing to do given the nature of their crime or what have you. But I think the way we need to start addressing nonviolent crimes and other crimes is a new phrase, and I know that it's been thrown around a lot, but it's not just tough on crime, it's smart on crime. And being smart on crime doesn't necessarily mean that you are being soft on crime. And I think that's the big problem is in the dialogue, especially when you're talking to politicians who stand for re-election, they don't want to be seen as soft on crime. They want to be tough on crime. And so this idea of being smart on crime and getting more for what we're doing in our criminal justice system is the way that this dialogue has been changing. And from my perspective as a legislator, and for you all that are interested in this topic, that's the best way to talk to people on the committee that I serve on the select committee that I also serve on, to make sure we're doing the best that we can. Things that gathered attention this session, Mr. Shaw brought it up, the ticketing in schools. That's a big change. You had 300,000 tickets being issued every year. I don't know, what was the youngest age? There was some testimony, 6? 6 years old. There was some record of a 6-year-old being cited in school. You know, that probably shows you that you're doing the wrong thing. So, and what you're doing is you're teaching kids that they are a criminal, not a student. Because when you take them out of the classroom setting and you put them in a courtroom setting, that's what you're telling them. That's the message that's going forward. You're a criminal, we're going to treat you as such, not we're going to route you back to the classroom, you're a student who needs help, and we're going to try and address those issues. I think that was a big victory this session, and so it was Senator West's effort, and a lot of people worked on that effort on both sides. I think it is, I think it's definitely done some good back home. I know I can speak to that going back home and being an attorney back home and hearing about different issues. That's one that I think is going well as it moved out. But Judge Likos talked about one-size-fits-all approaches and how we need to start to change that, and how putting kids in the same adult system can have a bad impact later on. I mean, studies have shown you throw a kid into an adult-only system or an adult-centric system, that child has a huge percent increase in not just reoffending, but violently reoffending. If you tweak that and look at juvenile-specific rehabilitation programs, those that can track people back into the right, in the right line in life, those are the ones that can help move people in the right direction. And so we need to look at getting away from, especially in the area of nonviolent juvenile offenders, one-size-fits-all approach. Now, a lot of people talk about and always say the children are our future. Children are our future. You hear that a lot, especially in political discourse. But until very recently, and actually due in large part to the work of this organization, we weren't really talking about young people in the criminal justice system, young people that were snagged, sometimes caught up with the wrong crowd or kind of in the wrong path, maybe mental health issues. We weren't talking about those children. We weren't talking about how we can kind of circumvent and move things in a different direction. I'll bring up an example, and it's one that got a lot of attention, mainly because it took a session and 2 special sessions to pass. But that was what ended up being Senate Bill 2, which happened to deal with 17-year-olds. So in Texas, 17-year-olds are adults. And I'm going to get to that at the end when I give us our charge for what we need to do after leaving here, or ideas that I think are going to be in the 84th session. 17-year-olds treated as adults here in Texas. And so the Miller v. Alabama case threw us into a group of 10 states, actually 13 states. There's 3 states that actually treat 16-year-olds as adults. We're not in that category. We're just one step above that. And the problem was that we could no longer sentence 17-year-olds as adults to life without possibility of parole. I think that what that bill gave us were 2 things. It gave us a fix, and it gave us an opportunity. I'm going to talk about the fix first, because there was disagreement about what we were doing. It was a mandatory sentence for those that were convicted of our most serious offense in the state of Texas. And there were stories around the state about heinous, egregious crimes. And, we fixed that number, life with parole opportunity at the age of 40. Now, whether we got that right or not, I don't know. The courts will ultimately get to debate that, and I'm sure we'll see it back at some point. But what it gave us, I think, during that discussion, other than just a fix to be able to move forward with the cases that were on the docket, was an opportunity to talk about. Because in the Miller case, there's a lot of discussion about brain chemistry, emotional development, how juveniles are different than adults, how they need to be looked at different. So that whole discussion and dialogue went on for both special sessions and got a lot of laser focus because it was one of only a handful of issues that was still being debated. And I think because of that, we're going to see a change in the way we approach juveniles. We're going to see a change in the way that we look at prosecution of those. 2 minutes? Man, being a lawyer and a politician, it's tough to keep to time limits. I think it really is going to bring about, and I think the biggest part of that conversation was, what can we do? What can we do going forward? This is clearly an issue. This is something that we need to address. And one of the overarching issues was mental health. Half of those incarcerated in juvenile facilities have mental health issues. And we find that out through self-reporting and a questionnaire that's filled out at the beginning of their incarceration. That's not adequate. That's not the best way to do these things. I think when you look at what's happened in Corsicana, as we started to phase, now it's being phased out, what we do going forward, how does the model look going forward? Going to more urban centers, more access to professionals, more access to family if they're willing to be part of the solution. These are the types of things that we need to address. And mental health and mental health funding is a big part of the solution to making sure that we are lowering the cost of incarceration and looking at actual solutions to getting people back on the right track. But the other things that we need to look at, and these are the things that I think are going to be issues going forward in the 84th session, moving 17-year-olds into the juvenile category. So moving into the majority of the states, and that's a bad way to sell a bill in Texas. I know I was telling a friend from California, you just don't start your speech with, well, this is how they do it in a bunch of other states. I saw more bills die like that. I tried to always figure out a way to not do it that way. But we're one of just 13 states that doesn't set the threshold at 18. That would have solved us a big discussion this year. SB 2 would not have been necessary. That case wouldn't have even affected Texas as a jurisdiction. I've submitted that as an interim charge. I don't know if it's going to be one that's selected, but I think we need to look at that. That does create a cost down to the local level for counties. Counties are the ones that are going to absorb a lot of the probation, rehabilitation costs, and prosecution costs if we move a whole age category into juvenile prosecution. So the other ones, we need to look at moving money away from lockup and into probation and rehabilitation. As we do that, I think you'll see, Mr. Shaw talked about, we can do more with less. And if you set those standards to where you have X amount of dollars for this project, but we're going to move more money into, we're going to move that and start to sway it over into more rehabilitative efforts and those that get people back on the right track. We need to have multiple options. The one thing I want everybody to take away is that you cannot have, especially for juveniles, one-size-fits-all approach, because traditional notions of criminal justice and deterrence don't work with juveniles. Those policies, throw them out the window. And so we need to look at what options we have. Look at certain types of offenses that juveniles are getting into, whether it be shoplifting, small-level drug offenses, graffiti. What can we do to track folks out of those prosecutions and criminalizing them at a young age and actually get them to buy into a solution, to buy into their own rehabilitation and their own empowerment to go on. Part of that is tracking them back into classrooms, and I look forward to talking about that. We've got a great program in El Paso that one of our JPs started that gets kids actually connected into the community college and gets them, but not just them, their parents, into programs that gets everybody kind of back in line. And a lot of the funds from that are private funds. So we need to look at more options. Everything we can have on the table, the more options we have on the table, the better, especially in dealing with juveniles. But I look forward to it. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I look forward to the conversation.
We're going to turn to Q&A now, and if the audience will permit, I'm going to seize the moderator's privilege and ask the first question. This is a question about something that happens just before we hit the prosecution stage. We have a lot of police officers in schools these days. I don't think it used to be that way, but it's just a modern phenomenon. And I've heard arguments for why this is a good thing. They're an important resource. I've heard arguments for why this is a bad thing. It's opened up a whole host of problems we hadn't anticipated. Who's got the better of that argument? Are the police officers in school ultimately for the better or for the worse? Maybe I should turn to our former law enforcement officers for this question.
Well, I think that it's a complicated issue, right? Because I think that, for instance, I'm going to take it to my personal experience. I was a career officer with the LAPD. I rose through the ranks to be the number 2 person there before I left to become a chief of police. And when we started the DARE program in LA, which became a national model for many years, we had officers that were in the school, that were unarmed, but they were in uniform, and they were really on a teaching capacity. And they became part of the teaching community within the school. They were not viewed as an enforcer, yet obviously their presence there carry a message of some level of safety and stability. And that evolved years later into the school resource officers, and now we have armed officers, and there is a greater level of enforcement. And again, I think it really depends on the community, right? If you have a community that tends to be, have less services and there's more crime, there seems to be an increase on the police activity. And one of the things that we did, we started to look at the impact depending on where the schools were located. And what we noticed was that in poorer areas, we had a tendency to be more enforcement driven. So for instance, the low-level offense that in our affluent communities would generally generate a call to the parents and, you know, come in and pick up Johnny and make sure that he doesn't use drugs anymore. In other parts of our community, generated a referral and the beginning of the cycle of criminalization. So I think that it's nuanced, and I don't necessarily believe that I have an answer, but I think that we really need to sort of take a step back and see, you know, how these resources are used. And you know, I look at there was a recent study, there was a Texas study by the Justice Center, Council of State Governments, which I was part of it, and school discipline. And it really pointed out, and by the way, Texas was used because Texas actually has some of the best data systems in education of any other state. Texas and Florida lead the way. California is completely out of whack. So we actually had the access to tremendous level of information to be able to gather information, do some analytical work. And we see through the study the horrible impact of discipline in the school in future behavior and dropping out of school. So there has to be a different conversation.
Okay. Any other questions in the audience?
Mr. Shaw, earlier you mentioned talking about crossover courts. Could you explain a little bit more in detail what you meant by those?
I meant it in the informal sense and in the formal sense. There is some legislation that was passed this past session creating the opportunity for some crossover courts, allowing a juvenile court to exercise some dual jurisdiction over kids who are also in the CPS system. But what I'm more excited about is in the general sense where we bring, you've got a kid who, ideally you do this before they hit the juvenile justice system, but you bring all of those resources together. You've got a kid in the juvenile justice system who also has had past contacts with CPS, who also either that child or the family that they live with, whether it's mom, dad, aunt, uncle, mental health issues in that house, and try and bring all resources together to address collaboratively those issues with that child. So that's what I meant when I said that. And one of the things that I think, I'm going to go off your topic for a second. One of the things that I look at, what can I as a prosecutor do when I see a 12-year-old for the first time, and that 12-year-old has just killed somebody. That's probably not the best point at which to start an intervention with that kid. And so a challenge for everybody is, how are we identifying these at-risk kids before that date? They're in school every day. How do we get communication with those schools and get kids plugged into resources before they even get to school? When you see a kid born into an at-risk situation, how do we, at an earlier age, even in the juvenile justice system, engage with these kids to get them on track? You know, my task was to talk about, you know, best practices. One of the things that can't go away or that won't go away I talked about the tension between short-term public safety and long-term public safety. There is almost, I can't conceive of a time when there isn't going to be a kid who, to protect the public, we've got to put away. And I will put that kid away, or I'll ask to have that kid put away, because they're too dangerous right then. And that's why we need something like the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, so that we can rehabilitate that kid so that he or she can come home and be safe and have a chance. So, but I am very, very excited about crossover courts and the concept of bringing those resources together and addressing those issues from as many angles as we can. Because we've got the resources, but nobody has been talking. CPS does their thing, MHMR does their thing, Juvenile does their thing.
I think this is thank you. I think this is a very important point which Riley Shaw's brought up about the when you have somebody, 11-year-old, 12-year-old that's murdered somebody, or we have a situation of a shooting someplace and we find out that that person was a known risky person, and then we find out that information was not passed along or it was not shared. Are there impediments, are there obstacles that in Texas we can do something about to overcome that, if that's part of the problem?
If you're talking about from a legal standpoint, yes, and from a practical standpoint, there are laws out there that provide privacy with regard to school records, that make it difficult for school districts to communicate some of this information to others, right? I think the bigger barrier is just no one is used to talking to each other. The biggest barrier is institutional inertia. I mean, I think the bigger barrier is you get everybody to change their thinking. Once that happens, then these laws, if they need to be tweaked, will be.
Yeah, and there's absolutely some legal restrictions, but I can tell you one of the things that and this has been a battle, by the way, this has been going on for 4 years in San Francisco now, but we're getting very close to signing up what we call a youth data share agreement. And we're bringing our school district, we're bringing health professionals, we're bringing our juvenile justice system, and we're bringing our social services. And the reason why we did that is we collected data for several years, and we noticed that in certain kids, when a young person touch any three of the systems, I'm talking about juvenile probation or juvenile justice system, has problems with the educational system, and either touches mental health or social services, when you come to the third intersection, within 90 days of that intersection crossing in San Francisco, you will be involved in a violent crime at about an 87% ratio probability. But the problem that we had, and by the way, I don't think our numbers are unique. Our numbers are very solid, and they're probably national numbers. I think you could use your own communities here. But the problem is that we don't share that information. Now, of course, we got a lot of restrictions around medical records. And the reason why we know these numbers, by the way, is we looked at them in the aggregate as opposed to individuals. But wouldn't it be nice when you have that level of information to be able to intervene early on and prevent that from occurring? And what we're trying to do is create a special master, actually, that would go behind the curtain, have access to this information, and get the systems that do not speak to one another to be able to talk. So there's tremendous amount of data there, and there's actually a lot of work that has been done around the connectivity between the use of the services and the predictability of criminal behavior, serious criminal behavior. In fact, I would offer you, and I don't have the answer to that if we were to take the girls out of these numbers, our probability rate would go even higher. So the work is there. I think it needs to be done. I think we could have a tremendous impact in our public safety and the way that we deal with young people.
Bill Hammond.
I'm curious, to what extent should it be, is character education, being taught in the public schools? And also, I'm wondering about, a second question, if you'll allow me, is, a lot of these school districts and now the community colleges and the universities all have their own police forces. Is that cost effective, and is it appropriate in terms of the issues that you all are dealing with?
Well, when I was in school, we had coaches.
All right.
But, times, of course, have changed. I'd like to give you all an example. There was an alternative school in Pasadena called the Challenger School, and we got them a $10,000 grant, and they started what's called complementary education after school. Now, bear in mind, these children were being bused in middle school from their original school to the alternative school, and then had to be bused back to that school. After school activities, and the money went for teachers to stay after school and for seniors to be sort of team leaders, if you will. And as you can imagine, it was sports, it was music, it was acting, it was community service, the arts, and so forth. The truancy rate in that school plummeted. Now, these are alternative kids, all right? It plummeted. The attendance rate rose. Their grades, their scores, and everything else on these cajillion tests that children have to take nowadays, they all rose. One of the things that concerns me today is the school districts, by and large, are using the juvenile probation department to weed out their so-called disruptive students. I would like to see them have more alternative education on campus, less Class C tickets being written, less criminalization of behavior back when many of us were in school didn't have the consequences that it has today. I know I see some folks here who probably, as boys, carried penknives to school, right? The gun racks and the pickup trucks and so forth. I mean, it was a more innocent time. Gangs are another problem. What are gangs but nothing but a perverted family? It gives you a sense of belonging, you have responsibilities, you have recognition, you have discipline. We have got to substitute that, and I hate to put another burden on schools. And one other thing about schools, one of my sister-in-laws has retired. She was teaching kindergarten and first grade and was being attacked by some of these children. And she couldn't even put her hand to fend them off. And then on the other hand, you have just the opposite, where they want to put a kid into juvenile probation because they wore a T-shirt they didn't like. So we've got to have some common sense solutions.
Before we take our next question, I was asked to remind everybody about the fire alarm, which we were told will go off any moment now. So in case there are any latecomers who didn't hear me, I apologize if it goes off during
Go ahead
your
and jump
question.
Okay.
Mr. Moody.
Just a comment in terms of police force at the different campuses. And you do see them at usually larger school districts will fund a police department. I know our universities do. It's a tough issue to deal with because you have a couple of different things. Are they there policing the folks that are there, keeping things in order on campus? But then we've seen a rash of school shootings, and so people have thought it is more important to have people on campus that can secure the students that are there, to secure the staff that's there. So there's a couple of different issues there. I think the usefulness, there is usefulness to them. I've prosecuted cases where the genesis was, a school officer that just happened to stumble upon a crime scene first. I mean, there are good things that are happening and good officers in some of those departments. But I think you can have a little bit of overkill, and you can get a campus feeling more like a correctional facility than an educational institution. I think it goes back to what I was talking about, making sure you're treating students like students and not criminals. And so it's a delicate issue because there are safety concerns, and there are things that can happen on campuses, just changing times. There are things that can happen on campuses that you do need a professional police force there to deal with.
James, we've got a question in the back there.
My question is primarily directed to Mr. Gaston, sir, because you see what you said touches on this more than the other fellows. It seems that throughout the country there's an increasing tendency of government, legislatures, judiciary, whatever, to usurp the authority of families to discipline children, and yet. I think we all know that the fundamental values that children learn that result in how they treat other people, they learn when they're between the ages of 3 and 6. family has to inculcate them into them. Would you think that this tendency to usurp the authority of families to discipline children, to begin them in their progress of becoming responsible adults, might some way be responsible for this increase in juvenile crime that we see?
I mean, first of all, there is no question that it all starts at the family, right? Generally, the kids that have a good family structure, I don't have to deal with, and I suspect that Riley probably doesn't have to deal with, or the judge. So there's no question that the value of the family and good parenting is not replaceable by government. I also agree with you that, and I think it's been said by other speakers, that increasingly we have become more intrusive as the criminal justice system. We have overlaid more and more regulation on the schools. We have criminalized behavior that 3 decades ago was not criminal, right? So I think that is a contributing factor. The only thing that I would add to that, though, is our world's a little more complex than it was 3 decades ago. We also see levels of violence in our schools that were certainly unheard of. And I came from a poor family, but we didn't have that level of violence in my schools that I see today. So the complexities are greater. But having said that, I think there's no question that wherever we can get to create a stronger bond around the family and how we build family responsibility, I think that is a place where we have to go. And I think that some of the things that collectively we're trying to do is we're trying to decriminalize some of this low-level behavior, but we got to put family accountability on the table. I tell you, one of the things that we do, we run a truancy court in my office, and by state statute district attorneys can actually prosecute parents for not having their kids go to school. But what we found out is that we wanted to use that hammer, but we did not necessarily want to criminalize the parents. So what we do is we bring the parents, we bring the young people, and we try to actually work agreements where we kick up, if you will, the accountability of the family. We find often that we deal with families that are single parent. They're families that have tremendous problems, mental health included. So we end up bringing a lot of other services to the table, and then we try to back away and get the kid back into the school. But you're absolutely right.
James, I think Ms. Elbert has a question up front.
I want to go back to something that Representative Moody and Judge Lykos talked about, is the thing about zero tolerance when you're dealing with the elementary school kids. And you label them as either a sexual harasser or violent because they're playing, cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians. What effect of having this standard have on labeling a child who, and then you have to have people come and say, you can't do this or you shouldn't be doing this and that, get this big uproar when it could have been dealt differently, but you have this standard.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be very careful in this when we're dealing with kids, and when you create that label and you create those problems at such a young age, you're probably, not probably, you are putting them on a path to more problems later on. I think it kind of pivots off of the last question as well. If you got kids that maybe don't have the great family structure at home, and then on top of that are in school and are getting labeled a certain way, you're just compounding the problem for them. What way are we tracking them towards? Are we moving them to a positive, positive place where they're going to go to college, get a job, become a business owner? Are we moving them that way, or are we moving them to a direction where, where they're just going to be in the system their whole life? So you need to, at the juvenile level, you need to change the dialogue of how we deal with kids. It needs to track back, like I said, back to the classroom and not the courtroom. I just mentioned at the end of my spiel about that program out in El Paso. They've had great success, and it helps to fix both parts of the problem because you don't always have the strong family structure at home. And so that kid, may be getting into the wrong things. You talked about the gang structure is kind of like a family structure. Some kids find their way into that as kind of a surrogate family. That program is built not just to address the issues that the child is having, but to get to get the parent in, get the parent a GED, get the parent on the educational track maybe that they need. So it's actually pushing them away from the court system and into an educational institution where maybe you actually have a chance to correct what's going on. So I mean, the words we use, the labels we put on kids are very, very important. You can track someone the wrong direction in a real quick fashion.
You were spot on with that question. I think that zero tolerance is nonsense. There are things that should be, and events should be handled there on a local level at the school. We're criminalizing normal behavior. If you have several siblings, you understand that each one has a different personalities. You know, little girls chase boys to kiss them. Little boys chase little girls in first grade to kiss them. And we're going to make this, call this child a sex offender. Boys scrap. It's almost a schizophrenic world that we're living in. You know, there are no more monkey bars because a child might fall and hurt themselves. And yet our children are exposed to so much that is perverse in our society. And I don't mean to be harsh on school districts. I mean, I don't know why anybody would want to be a superintendent of a school district, you know, unless they were a masochist. Because so many demands are being made on them. But by and large, they're there, we're funding them, they need to have some common sense solutions. Every child is different, and teachers are recommending that boys be put on drugs because, you know, they get up and walk around the room. I predict, right now what you're seeing with all these mental health issues are the consequences of the tune in, turn on, drop out, the drugs that they took, and then the parents and then the grandparents, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And if we keep young kids who are just being kids and put them on these drugs, then you can imagine what sort of future that they're going to have. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be preaching. I know I sound like my grandmother, too.
Do we have dudes?
One of the problems we think a lot of these people have, they don't have no role models. They grew up god-awful, you know, in very strange circumstances and that sort of thing. What is the training level of the people who are in contact with these people with regard to how to handle people, how to use authority, that sort of thing? What's the training level? Can you tell me?
Well, I know in Harris County, we replaced boot camp because they went through boot camp. I went to the graduations. The parents were so proud. It was just like my generation when we went to the graduation of the real military boot camps, how proud we were. But then there was no follow-through. And so you ended up having a healthier, more disciplined criminal, all right? But you sent him back into the same environment. So no, we're training people nowadays. Risk assessment, that is one of the greatest things that's ever occurred, is to do your risk assessment so we can divert those children who don't need to be put into detention, who don't need to have petitions filed against them. And but again, thank you for that question because, and there's so many things, I don't like the word role model, I think examples. And please, if I never hear the word self-esteem again, it'll be too soon. You esteem others. It's narcissistic to have self-esteem. Self-respect. Can you look in that mirror? And we do need to have character education in school. We do need to have the volunteers. The police officers could take the lead, I think, in character development and so forth. They need to become involved and interact with the students, and maybe academically in some way, so that they're just not prison guards.
Oh, question up front.
Tailing off on your comments, Judge Lycos, what have y'all found? You said y'all had 40 programs, 40 plus programs in Harris County. To what have been the most effective programs for giving juvenile offenders, 15, 16, 17 years of age, career direction?
We don't handle 17-year-olds.
Oh, you don't?
They age out when they turn 17. And bear in mind the success rate, the stats that I rattled off. Our population in Harris County increases like 40,000 annually. And to see this continued drop with this in-migration of people, So you don't have the stable neighborhoods that you had before. I think our programs have been very successful because they're discrete and they address specific types of issues. And once this is over with, if you'd like, I'll visit with you and not just go through all 40 programs now.
Up front.
Well, somebody in Travis County can't really talk about, disparities as far as sentencing and DWIs, but obviously, a case brought attention there. But maybe the larger issue, the affluence or whatever, is that maybe there's certain people need to be in mental health facilities, but you can't afford $500,000 to put in a private rather than in the actual state system. So, I think it raises a larger issue because, yes, there are certain people that need to be put in, mental health systems in the criminal setting, and there's a question, how effective those are.
Are you asking how effective the mental health programs are in the juvenile justice system?
Yes, is there a sense that they're not that effective? So what do you do if you can't opt out of it with your own private?
Well, I'll tell you, my sense is that mental health in Texas leaves something to be desired as a system. Everyone here who's old enough remembers when that system was basically dismantled 30 years ago. There is a need for increased quality mental health care for juvenile age offenders or non-offenders, juvenile aged kids. TJJD, our one statewide institution, they provide mental health care services, but they're not built to be a mental health facility. That's not their statutory role. That's something they're called upon to do, and they try real hard to get it right. But it's tough to tell you your primary mission is over here, but we also want you to do this other thing really well. So it's something that needs to be looked at. It's something that we really need to focus some attention on and increase the availability and quality of those services.
You struck a chord with me, and I'm talking about adults now. We didn't have homelessness prior to the shutting down of most of our mental institutions, okay? And whether they're mentally ill and self-medicate or whether because they use drugs, they then become mentally ill, that's the question. But we tried to get a project started in Harris County where we would get a dormitory, motel, whatever, single room occupancy where we could divert those who were charged with nonviolent offenses like dumpster diving and so forth into these facilities, keep them out of the jail. They get the SSI so they can pay for their room and board. You have the meds there, the treatment there. Try to go ahead and transition those who are capable of it into society again, and to the nutrition. And the sheriff's office was willing to volunteer deputies and so forth. All these people were volunteering except the mental health community. They want to know where the grant was. We need to change our mental health laws. God forbid that you have someone in your family who is dangerous and you try to get them committed, an involuntary commitment, and next thing you know, they sign themselves out. I know that doesn't have anything to do with juvenile justice, but Representative Moody, you and I are going to be talking.
One of the previous presentations I've been to with the foundation was talking about that aspect of mental health, because suddenly our jails are becoming.
Harris County is the largest mental health institution in the sovereign state of Texas. That's a sin. Excuse me.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's a humanitarian issue, it's a public safety issue, and it's a public health issue, and we need to address it.
I don't know that I could say anything better than that. It's two-pronged. It's inadequate, and we're not collecting data to fix it. So, you had just a few years ago, TYC was releasing criminally dangerous folks with MHMR referrals that weren't mandatory and weren't checked up on because they couldn't serve the population. that's a problem. That's something that shouldn't be. But in our county jails, which are operated, a huge county jail system like we have in Harris County, and the bigger cities and smaller ones across the state have programs that are, who knows what's working, what's not working. We're not collecting the data on that, but we don't even know what's going on in there. So you've got to start at that point. It's inadequate. We know that. What do we do about it? We need to start collecting information to see what's actually working, what's not, and then go from there.
Well, we have to call Q&A to a close, but before everybody gets up and leaves, I've got just a few quick announcements, if you'll indulge me. First of all, events like this don't come together spontaneously, so I want to acknowledge Mike Joyce, TPPF's events coordinator, and also Olivia Gustin with our Center for Effective Justice, who've done so much work to put this on today. Secondly, his name came up several times. I think most of you in the audience know my colleague Mark Levin. Mark wishes he could be here today. He sends his regards, but he just had an obligation that he could not escape from. But we would not be here if it were not for the extraordinary work that Mark has done over the last several years. So he says hello. Third, I want to note that shortly after the legislative session ended, we made 2 new hires in the Center for Effective Justice that I'm really excited about. The first is Derek Cohen, who's joined us as a policy analyst. Derek came to us from the doctoral program in criminal justice at the University of Cincinnati, and he cautions me not to call him Dr. Cohen yet because he's this close to completing the dissertation. But when he is done with it, he will be Dr. Cohen. We also hired Sarah Rumpf, who is the communications coordinator for our National Right on Crime campaign. Sarah was an attorney in Florida and then jumped into the communication sphere. She's run several national campaigns. She has a major presence on social media, and we're really excited to have her managing all of our communications efforts. For those of you in the room who work daily in this sphere, please don't leave without going and saying hello to Derek and Sarah. They're going to be a huge part of our efforts in the coming year in the next legislative session. Go get a card from them and make sure that you know who they are. Finally, this was our last TPPF primer of the year. We're constantly working to make them better. We're going to have dynamic ones next year, but to make them as good as possible, you've got to fill out the evaluation cards that we have placed inside your programs. Please make sure that you fill those out. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming today. Can't wait to see you again next year.